Well, it's great to be invited. Thanks so much for organizing this, Giovanni. This is a very nice opportunity to discuss. Hopefully, we will soon be discussing in Italy at some point. I want to, so this talk is indeed very much in line with the previous questions. That is, what do you know about what's happening in antiferromagnets? And what the approach we've taken is to look, that is to do imaging experiments and to do it on a material now that's been studied electrically in a number of labs, hematite. This is really a group effort. It's in fact, I'm representing a team that consists of Ohio State University and Yang's group who made these beautiful epitaxial samples. We're working with Hendrik Oldeg and Rajesh Chadekar, who are at ALS and who are experts at PEAM imaging and other techniques, and particularly on studying antiferromagnets. And the experiment was done by Ege Kogolu and Néel Statuto. And we were very fortunate because we did this experiment and completed it essentially March 10th, 2020. So about a year ago, and the beam shut down as these guys were leaving. So we were very lucky to get that experiment in and get some very interesting data. So what I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to again maybe give a review of why people are so interested in these materials and in current-induced switching. I'll talk about some of the unique aspects of alpha Fe2O3, a ferromagnetic film with a small, well, it's an antiferromagnet with a small moment, so you can manipulate the Néel vector with a modest magnetic field. So it allows you to do correlations between magnetoresistance measurements and say imaging experiments or magnetoresistance and switching experiments. And then I'll tell you about the experiment. The experiment is that we apply electrical pulses while we do XMLD. And we found a number of surprises. One is we can also look at the equilibrium orientations of the Néel vector. And so I'll tell you about that. And then we can image what happens when we switch domains, when the scale of the structure is on the scale of the domain size in the antiferromagnet. And then I'll summarize our findings. So introduction. So I think the exciting thing here is that we have a mechanism, it can be to manipulate antiferromagnets that doesn't require huge magnetic fields that can potentially be very, very fast. It's very difficult to manipulate antiferromagnets, as you've heard earlier. Essentially, it's hard to couple to the staggered order. A magnetic field it doesn't do this very effectively. Especially if there's anisotropies and a reasonable Néel temperature. But the spin-orbit torques and also spin-orbit interactions general, but I'm speaking mainly about torques generated by heavy metals or materials with large spin-orbit coupling that are in contact with antiferromagnets. These torques have a form which is quite interesting, which is polarization crossed into the sublattice moments, which means that this torque or field alternates on different lattice sites. So a uniform polarization like you would generate with spin orbit torques can effectively lead to a staggered magnetic field, so can couple on the atomic scale to the order. So that's one of the interesting things. So we should be able, and it's been shown that the Néel vector for these spin orbit torques will tend to orient perpendicular to the spin accumulation or parallel to the charge current when you apply, when you solve these set of coupled differential equations. Essentially, H effective includes the coupling between the two sublattices. So there have been a lot of very nice experiments, starting again with these kind of star-shaped samples, where you look at magnetoresistance. So you apply pulses and then measure the resistance, and the signal can be the something like the planar Hall effect or the spin magnetoresistance signal. And you can see basically the signals that alternate as you apply pulses along different directions. And in iron oxide, there have been two experiments, one by the Ohio State group and one by an MIT group, Lu Chaolu, that have seen this kind of behavior. And there's also been experiments that show you can see this behavior, as you heard in the last talk, when you don't even have antiferromagnetism. And so that, but Qilin Chen did a very nice experiment where he showed you can see this kind of charging, discharging characteristic on insulating substrates. So the title of the paper was Absence of Evidence. Of course, absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. And so the idea here of our work is to look for evidence that there actually is reorientation of the antiferromagnetic domains. We do know, this is beautiful experiment in Matthias Klauwe's group, that you can excite spin waves and detect spin waves in alpha 203, so you can create dynamics that's associated with creating non-equilibrium spin. So there's every reason to expect you can do some kind of switching with spin orbit torques. And then there's this very nice experiment, which is the inverse of what we want to do, essentially. That is exciting a antiferromagnetic Néel vector with a microwave field and detecting the resulting spin currents that are generated in adjacent heavy metal. So this is work done in Enrique Del Barco's group at UCF, University of Central Florida, with David Letterman and other people you probably recognize doing the theory. And what they saw is that you can simultaneously detect the absorption signal of the microwaves and an inverse spin Hall effect, so a voltage that appears across a platinum electrode associated with spin to charge conversion. And they were able to see the symmetries of these effects in this measurement, different symmetries depending on the circularity of the helicity of the light, etc. And there was also another experiment of this type on chromium oxide by the group at UC Riverside. So there's evidence that you can, antiferromagnetic dynamics can generate a spin current. So it makes sense that you should be able to generate an oscillator by injecting spin currents, and you should be able to switch antiferromagnets. And that's what many of us are trying to do. So why this hematite? The hematite is essentially, again, don't have to go through this. I mean, this is kind of the whole point of this workshop, is that we can work with antiferromagnets and they can have very, very fast dynamics. I guess the key point here for antiferromagnets, this antiferromagnet, is it has a small excess moment due to DMI, and that there leads to a small canting of the moments in the EZ plane. So we're going to talk about C-axis oriented Fe2O3. So that small canting means with a field of about a Tesla, you can reorient the Néel vector to be essentially perpendicular to the field. So you can do an experiment where you rotate the Néel vector and measure the magnetoresistance, again in a structure like you've seen earlier. So that is an experiment that's been done, and you can see beautiful, basically, magnetoresistance changes or changes in the transverse resistance that follow the expected symmetry of the response. This material also has 3 easy axes in the plane, so you should be able to switch between 3 possible directions of the easy axis by applying currents along 3 different directions. So this is so you can use this magnetoresistance then to gauge to what extent the magnetic order is changing. And this is, again, an experiment that was done at Ohio State University, where they applied pulses along these different directions, E2, E3, E1, and you could see you get to different resistance states, and these different resistance states could be correlated back to the magnetoresistance. And what you could learn from that is that a fraction of the domains in the area of this Hall cross responded to the current. Of course, what we'd like to know is the mechanism, what is going on and what is producing those changes. And that's where we come to the imaging experiments I'm going to talk about. So what we're doing is XMLD and sometimes XNCD, and this allows us to probe the absorption that's dependent on the polarization of the light. So the origin of this, we're mostly going to focus on XMLD. The linear dichroside can be related to asymmetries in the crystal, or into the spin of the material. And we're focusing on the, of course, the magnetic part. We focus our experiments on the iron edges, the L2A and L2B edges of the iron oxide. And this shows some of the beam images we've taken of a section of that, of a Hall star. And this shows, these are the domains. They're less than a micron, maybe of order of a micron. This is a 5-micron bar. The bright regions are the regions where the platinum is etched away. And the dark regions are regions where there's 2 nanometers of platinum on the surface. What we see here is a fairly irregular pattern of domains, kind of strings, but they go through the regions that are patterned. So the pattern doesn't affect the domains that we see on the surface of the material. We can go smaller. So we saw this and we said, well, we should really try to get down to closer to the domain size. This is an image we just took a few weeks ago at ALBA, in the synchrotron at ALBA, where we looked at the whole, you can see the whole cross structure. Again, the dark regions are the platinum, and you can see these kind of domains. And then we've even gone smaller. We've gone now to the point where the Hall cross now is on the scale of the antiferromagnetic domain. So you can see the domains, and this, again, the current paths are these paths, the darker regions in these images. So what's the experimental geometry is we can vary the X-ray polarization. We have two types of polarizations that I'll focus on in this talk. Sigma, which is in the plane of the film, and pi polarization, which has components out of the plane. The signal we're going to get is proportional to the projection of the Néel vector on the polarization direction of the X-rays, the magnitude of that. Again, as we can rotate the polarization continuously from sigma to pi. And the first experiment, well, at least this was an experiment that was very important to understanding what was going on, is we took the sample with, at this point, no pattern, and just rotated it about its normal. And what you'd expect if you rotate about the normal is that if the domains are completely in plane, 180-degree rotation will bring you back to the same contrast. For sigma polarization, that has to be the case because it doesn't matter if the domains are in or out of plane, the polarization is in the plane. For pi polarization, you can convince yourself that if the domains are oriented in the plane, that it should come back. And in fact, we find it does not come back. So in sigma polarizations, maybe a little difficult to see. We highlighted this region, it goes light, then dark, then light, it comes back to its original contrast. In pi polarization, it's dark, different, and then light when you do almost 180-degree rotation. So this tells us that the Néel vector in these films in equilibrium is not entirely in the plane of the film. So that's a bit of a surprise, and then wouldn't expect based on the crystal structure of the film, the epitaxial nature of this C-axis oriented film. So this is important information, at least in understanding what I'll show you, what I'll show you next. So again, that's the polarization. This is what we do. We have only 4 leads actually in our experiment at ALS. We can apply pulses on 2 of them, and the sample is arranged so the bottom lead is cut. So we apply current either from this point, which we call pulse A, or from this point, pulse B, and we look at what happens to the domains after we apply pulses, just like it's done in the electrical studies. And again, this is a 30-nanometer film with 2 nanometers platinum. We can see through the platinum, and in the lab, we also do pulse experiments like the ones I showed you earlier. We take the sister samples of this one and measure, and we can see the same pulse response that was reported earlier by Fenyan's group and also by the MIT group. So we can see that there are resistance changes associated with applying pulses to the sample. So the next step is, let's see what happens. So we want to correlate these changes with changes in the antiferromagnetic order. So this is the experiment we've done now with 4 milliamp currents. This is the initial state. We apply pulse A, and we see there's a change in the contrast. You can see the red point here. This red area is an area in the platinum lead where the pulse A current flows, and we see a change there. Then we apply pulse B, and we see there's an additional change in this region. And then we apply pulse A again, and we come back to something very close to this image. The states are labeled by the preceding pulse. So pulse A, after pulse A, we call the state pulse A, state A. After pulse B, we call it state B, etc. To label this. And we can highlight the differences by taking just the difference images before and after pulse A, before and after pulse B, etc. And we can see that this region here switched. You can see it there. This region here switched, and this region here switched back to the original state. So we can see a couple of things. One is we can see there's irreversible switching, this red zone, and there's also reversible switching, where the current swaps the antiferromagnetic work back and forth. And these are composite images that are taken both sigma and pi. They're the net dichroism, if you like. And we can also go further into detail. I'll show you in a moment. So this shows, yes, there are indeed changes in the key takeaways here are resistance changes are indeed associated with changes in antiferromagnetic order. Only a fractions of the domains switch, which is consistent with the electrical data. And there are regions that switch reversibly and also regions that switch irreversibly. So we can look at we can get more information by looking at the individual polarizations. That is, we can try to see which direction is the Néel vector actually switching. We can probe in-plane directions with sigma and out-of-plane components with pi. And so the contrast changes if and only if the Néel vector projection on the X-ray polarization changes. So this shows state B. This shows this little domain is the one that switched, and we can say that it has a component along the line here, like indicated here. And this is, again, that same image with same case, state B, same configuration of the sample after the pulse B, taken with these pi polarization. And you can see this dark contrast. And the dark contrast tells us that the antiferromagnetic order is mostly parallel to the polarization. And the light contrast here says the antiferromagnetic order is mostly perpendicular to the polarization. So in this case, mostly along the line. So that's interesting. We have seen contrast is consistent with it having an out-of-plane component to the Néel vector. And what we think is happening is that we're switching between states that have in-plane and out-of-plane components, namely that we know there's an out-of-plane component in equilibrium, and and there's changes in the in-plane contrast and out-of-plane contrast, which we could represent by this diagram. And we can look at that even further. We can look at now the images with sigma and pi polarization, and we can see contrast changes in the sigma polarization again as we go from state B to state A, and similarly in the pi polarization. So the contrast changes are actually larger in the pi, it's consistent with the picture that I drew earlier, that they're in plane and out of plane. There's an out of plane component associated with the Néel order, and we're switching between states with different in-plane projections as well. So this is one of the key observations is really you wouldn't know this based on the crystal structure or on or directly the electrical measurements, but indeed there is more complicated dynamics going on. In fact, if you go up in current, you find really interesting things, further interesting things. So we go up 50% in current, 6 milliamps. And again, you see these changes. This is the region that was switching back and forth. And if you look at the difference images, you find more differences and even different. These regions here are the ones I showed you earlier. Now the contrast is different because we're seeing even bigger changes in contrast outside the region where the current flows. So this blue region, for example, is well outside the current path and changes irreversibly. So you have changes outside the flow of current, which says that this is not entirely, cannot be a entirely spin orbit torque effect. In fact, it has to be some other effects. In the current region, you can imagine spin orbit torques are playing a role. And there are obviously some other effects going on, which we ascribe to thermal effects, essentially magnetoelastic effects. So what have we found? Well, we found we can use this technique to really look at switching in antiferromagnets. And we need currents on the order of 10 to the 8th amps per square centimeter to see switching. And the results are consistent with in-plane switching of the Néel order that has an out-of-plane component. And we've identified two types of regions. Reversible switching almost always occurs in the region where the current flows, and irreversible switching occurs where there's outside the region, and also in regions where the current density direction doesn't change significantly. For example, in this arm of one of the Hall crosses, most of the current changing is in the central region of the Hall cross. So these are GIF images. This is not a time resolved movie. This is putting together the image as I showed you earlier, showing what happens after 20 pulses of type A, 20 pulses of type B, etc. So you can see the main conclusions. We just this paper, a paper on this is about to appear in PRB letters, and it's also on the archive, so you can look at that. And there's a great deal of detail associated with the analysis, namely how do you analyze the different polarizations, images, and also how do we estimate all the thermal effects, which are part of that paper. So I encourage you to look at that. And this is us in January. This is Ege Gogolu, again, who did the work with Noah Statuto. And look how happy we were. We didn't know what was coming, but thankfully we got this beam time in, and we managed to do this experiment. And in fact, hopefully we'll be out of this COVID pandemic in next fall, maybe next summer. Maybe the positive thing is we had a lot of time to analyze data, and this was a lot more complicated than we had originally suspected. Thank you very much.